Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We're so excited to be here, and in particular to talk about something a little different than we normally do today. And that's building culture, process, and organization for web engineering at scale. Instead of focusing on the technical side of Twitter.com as we have in the past, we're going to talk instead about the people behind it and how we all work together. And one important thing to note is that although we're web engineers talking about our web community, we believe that most of what we're going to talk about is applicable to any or all client engineering teams. Before we get into that, though, here's us. Hi, I'm Charlie.
And I'm Marina. Hello.
And we are both group tech leads, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in short, what that means is together we're responsible for all of the development on Twitter.com, including the health of the code base and the community of engineers that help build the site. Here's a quick look at what we're going to be covering so you can get oriented. We'll start with some background on the history of web at Twitter. Then we'll talk about the organizational structures we've tried and some of the trade-offs there. We'll finish with some concrete things we've implemented in the web community and what we've done to take care of the people and the culture as we've grown and moved around.
Okay, so first let's talk about where we're coming from so that you have some context about how we got to where we are today. Charlie and I, we've both been at Twitter for 8 to 9 years, and in that time have experienced a huge amount of change at the company, including many different reorgs. At the start, there was just a single web team. Later, as the company started growing, client engineers were embedded on feature teams. However, we hit a period when there weren't enough web engineers to sustain the embedded model, so we moved back into a single team around 2017. From there, we grew fairly slowly up until this past year, during which we've grown a huge amount, from 40 regular contributors to close to 100 today. And during this whole time, we also rewrote Twitter.com into a PWA and moved onto a modern tech stack. So the central premise and the focus of our talk today is to share what we've learned from trying these different org structures and what we think is the optimal setup to enable growth for individuals and teams and how to run web engineering at scale.
So as Marina mentioned, there's a lot of ways that we've been organized as web developers at Twitter, and we want to dive in and talk about some of those now. As a preface, we believe that client development sits at the junction of product verticals and the user experience. And this is why we love working on the web at Twitter, and really why we find it so challenging and why we made this presentation. And it's worth picking that apart a little bit more because I really think that it's the key to understanding what's hard about client engineering. Companies usually develop efforts in terms of products, not platforms. So they might say, we need to focus on onboarding and retaining people, or we want to improve the creator's experience. Users, on the other hand, rarely think of things in terms of product areas. They just use whatever platform or device they have, and they just want the entire app to be fast and consistent. So client engineers are the people who take new products and ideas and have to blend them into a cohesive technical product for their customers. And they have to do this inside a shared code base that every other team is simultaneously contributing to. They're also the team that takes the bricks of features, applies some glue, and builds that into a house that can support itself. And there's some joke about architecture and software architecture in there somewhere. So we as client engineers have this dual role of needing to support the product as the company sees it and the product as the user sees and experiences it.
So broadly speaking, we've seen two ways to structure engineering development teams. We've gone back and forth and tried both of these twice each at different points in our time at Twitter. We're not saying that one is inherently better than the other. Each way has its trade-offs, and one may make more sense than the other depending on the size or company goals at any given time. So on one hand, you have horizontal teams, which are made up of people within the same discipline or function. A discipline or function, for example, would be web engineering, backend, ML, or data science, etc. On the other hand, you have vertical teams, which are made up of people from multiple disciplines or functions, and are typically organized by feature or project or product area. The same team would contain web engineers and iOS, Android, backend, etc. The team most likely also has a product manager, a designer, user researcher, or data scientist embedded on the team. Here are a couple diagrams to compare the two setups. On the left, we have horizontal teams where each example is made up of just web engineers on the web team or just iOS engineers on the iOS team. And on the right, we have vertical teams where each example contains engineers performing different functions and jobs on the same team. Each team's mission is focused on a specific feature area like home or notifications. Now let's look at the strengths and weaknesses of horizontal teams. All of these strengths are built on the fact that you have a critical mass of engineers together who all talk the same language, literally. This means that there are many opportunities to grow across the functional domain, from feature work to platform or performance or UI. There are also many opportunities for peer mentorship and learning from varied expertise. It's easy to cultivate a strong sense of shared ownership and develop consistent processes and norms. On the flip side, the weaknesses start to show as the teams scale and have multiple EMs or multiple levels. There's more overhead to communicate with other disciplines and project teams. This leads to folks being potentially out of step with other disciplines, or getting added to projects late and missing out on early ideation or technical design. It could also be difficult to get investment or staffing after a certain size. And now let's look at the strengths and weaknesses of vertical teams. Vertical teams really excel for focused execution on a feature area or coordinated cross-functional project. By having all disciplines dedicated to the same feature or project on the same team, it vastly eases and improves coordination and communication. Each function is also able to be involved from design and brainstorming to prototyping all the way to production. On the flip side, the weaknesses reflect what's missing from not having centralized horizontal teams. Mainly isolation from a large group of peers who do the same type of work, and lack of opportunities to grow across the technical domain. This leads to both cultural problems like ownership cracks and loose stewardship, as well as technical problems like code silos and pattern divergence. You might notice now that these strengths and weaknesses really mirror those of horizontal teams, which reflects what we mentioned earlier about how there isn't one clearly superior structure, and it's more about the size and needs of the company at any given stage.
Okay, so we've tried both of these configurations on the web at Twitter, and I'll probably regret saying this, but as we've just now shifted into a vertical product team, I think we're finally reaching our final form this year, because it's just hard to grow forever as a horizontal client team. Given the trade-offs Marina just mentioned, we think most companies are going to pressure you into vertical teams eventually. It's just easier to match up products and teams that way at scale. And this is one of the central things we believe we've learned through Twitter's growth. So if you accept that, then it's up to us as client engineers to mitigate the weaknesses of the vertical team structure as best we can. And that's what the community model and the rest of the presentation aims to do. And I'd argue the most important time to work on and think about these issues is right before you transition and grow. Our web developer count has more than tripled this year so far, and we got really lucky by having tried this before and been through some of these challenges already. Previously, we saw people leave because they were isolated, not getting enough mentorship, or interesting opportunities. Or perhaps just because the code wasn't fun or easy to work with. Now when people leave, it's to spend more time with their kids, start rap careers, or join the circus, all of which are true stories. That we can live with because it means we're doing a great job of ensuring individuals are prospering, happy, and living their best lives.
Okay, we're going to expand on the vertical team weaknesses some more so we can better understand how to mitigate them. To start, let's look at peer isolation. This occurs when someone isn't close enough to people who are passionate about the same things as them at different levels of expertise. As engineers, we need both teaching and learning opportunities, a chance to both be an expert but also to get better. This is typically not as big of a problem at the start of moving from horizontal to vertical teams, as there are some existing relationships to lean on. But over the long term, this can really stunt growth and lead to attrition. The problems tend to also affect smaller, newer, and less experienced teams more severely. Second, lack of opportunities or variety. This stems from the fact that a vertical team's mission is centered on a feature area. This means that the engineers on this team are dedicated to just a slice of functionality in the app and would typically have less freedom to work on other areas or types of work, such as platform or infrastructure projects. And that makes sense because their teams and managers are tasked with achieving feature-specific OKRs. However, many engineers typically like to work on a variety of projects and problems so that they can grow both depth and breadth in their field. If the system is too inflexible or if it's too difficult to make moves, This can also stunt growth and lead to attrition in the long term. And a paired problem is that this makes it more difficult to cultivate a strong sense of shared ownership of the whole code base, where everyone feels empowered to improve things beyond just their lane. And lastly, let's talk about code siloing. This is a technical issue that follows from engineer isolation. It occurs when engineers on different teams don't have regular communication or ways of sharing ideas and challenges. So what could happen is that different feature areas start to be built using different code patterns, and divergence happens in how people build in the same app. This then leads to code being more inconsistent, harder to work with, and harder to onboard for new people. People's experience and skills also become less transferable from team to team or feature to feature. In our experience, this tends to occur due to the lack of strong platform guardrails and lack of process for cross-pollination. If allowed to fester for too long, this could even result in having to rebuild the entire app because it's beyond saving.
So now that we understand some of the weaknesses of the vertical team model, let's talk about how we mitigate their impact and keep those problems from happening. And we can skip right to the thesis. Each discipline needs a secondary structure that creates a focus on community and technology. And there's kind of a parenthetical at the end, which is because vertical teams are not incentivized to provide these on their own. We need to introduce some way of foreseeing or incentivizing cross-team collaboration. This isn't to say product-based EMs are hostile to the platform or wouldn't support this, because they do. But you as a functional area leader need to make it easy for them to just say yes, because it's too easy otherwise for fostering a community to fall through the cracks. This structure must support the individuals within it while also providing value back to vertical teams. We've called our secondary structures pods, and as you can see, they're sort of a half measure to mimic some of the structure and benefits of horizontal teams. And they have three main components. First, each pod is a small group of engineers from various teams who can technically and socially support and complement each other. Second, each pod has a tech lead, someone who can synthesize and surface day-to-day issues, and just make sure that all the technical ducks are in a row. And finally, we have group tech leads in each larger organization, whose responsibility it is to collaborate across org boundaries. That's what Marina and I do. The group tech lead role helps ensure that issues raised by pods and pod tech leads from across the platform get surfaced to company leadership and can actually be addressed. And if you're averse to structure, this can sound like a lot, but we really think it's just a formalization of some of the things most teams would be doing anyways. Pods are a small place where you can help introduce people who are new to development on the platform. They serve as an onboarding tool. I love onboarding, right? Everyone needs to be onboarded. They're also a great place to review code, design docs, and talk about code-base related technical issues, or provide and receive mentorship. And finally, in a time when we're more remote than ever, they're a great social forum where people can play games or gossip about things like Scala.js or what their favorite pipeline operator is. We gave guidance that these groups should probably have a private Slack room and maybe spend an hour or so each week together, just sharing project context or hanging out in addition to whatever technical time they were already spending, things like coding booths or peer reviews and so on.
And while pods are the foundation of our community, we also need a lot of other practices and processes to complement and bring it all together. As a community leader, some of these you may need to implement yourself, and others you'll need to find passionate people to take on. We started with really fundamental things, like a value statement that we call LIT, which stands for Learn It, Improve It, and Teach It, and a regular all hands that we call Web Community Hour. What we've learned is that as the community grows, it becomes harder and harder to reach everyone together. So you need a mix of different types of activities and rituals to appeal to different people's interests and personalities. A couple of my favorite practices, for example. Brunch and Learn is a monthly time to give in-depth tech talks and a chance to share expertise. Web Buds is a new program to establish cross-pod, one-on-one peer relationships that can serve as buddies or mentors. And Community Kudos is a way to publicly share gratitude and thanks for when other people help you out. In addition to our community practices, we also wanted to highlight some of our technical processes, which are in place to foster shared stewardship, scalable ownership, and continuous improvements. I'll talk about two that are very dear to me. The first is postmortems. Through grassroots efforts, we've had a postmortem process since 2018. In that time, we've grown a sizable number of voluntary shepherds who run postmortems for the community after every incident. A blameless postmortem culture helps us find proportional investments in our tools and processes so that we can avoid making the same mistakes and the same incidents in the future. And second is TL selection, or tech lead selection. It's very important to us to create transparent and equitable leadership opportunities. And we found that the way to do this is to open TL roles to applications and then to evaluate candidates based on a rubric. We also believe that tech lead roles are a hat that people wear and that it's healthy for the individual and for teams to rotate in and out of these roles. Now, from social to technical, each practice and process tries to tackle the problem of bringing the community together and creating an inviting and enjoyable place to work in. All of it combined creates a community feel that is hard to define, but makes a tangible difference in people's day-to-day work experience.
Now at this point, it might sound like pods and communities are some kind of snake oil or magical cure-all, and that's not the case. They're just a starting point, or where our particular group of engineers led us. So a few other thoughts and notes. You want to foster a code base without boundaries, yes, but the practical truth is that you can't just rely on the goodwill of feature contributors alone to keep your architecture alive and healthy. You still need a clear group to own large, dedicated platform projects. Things like creating or maintaining your design system, or perhaps migrating your data storage from something like Redux to Relay. These are efforts that need a strong central driver. Anyone can contribute to adding type safety, for instance, but someone needs the vision and responsibility for ensuring that it happens. And you need a platform team, but also distributed and, more importantly, representative leadership. Your platform team cannot be your sole source of that leadership. This is to ensure that there's a healthy discourse around decisions that affect all developers. New features and designs will constantly be pushing the boundaries of what your code-based patterns are capable of. And platform engineers will constantly be pushing for strict reuse, which is a great boon for developer speed. Lean too much one way or the other, and you'll either prevent innovation or lose any semblance of reusable, easy-to-learn patterns. Knowledge, and thus power, should be distributed. So having leaders from both feature and platform on equal footing is really important. If your leads group is small, but still represents every developer, it'll be a great group to discuss and approve new processes and proposals in a way that inherently has community buy-in. The setup isn't a one-shot process or something we got right out of the gate. So think of it more as a constitution, a starting place that welcomes amendments. Okay, so that's an in-depth look at what we're trying out right now, and before we end, we just want to quickly rehash some of the key points we've talked about.
We truly believe that vertical teams are needed for a company to scale. Especially in a distributed world, you need to get the right people across different disciplines working closely together in order to develop and ship quickly.
But vertical teams are imperfect. They have trade-offs and flaws. They may be best for the company, but they're not always best for every individual engineer.
So as platform or discipline leaders within a company, it's up to us to enable sustainable vertical teams by creating a community with shared values and practices that help the code base scale and engineers to grow.
And this will be a big push as you grow, maybe even a nostalgia for a time when the community was small enough that everyone was in on every decision. And slowly you'll have to get away from that. Gather input from all corners, but don't let democratization block you. Build a central point of contact with trusted and empowered decision makers.
Most importantly, listen to your own people and learn about their values and challenges, and use those to develop your own set of norms and practices to build an inclusive community for your engineers. Now, this whole presentation is what's worked for us as web engineers at Twitter, and we know that every company and team has unique circumstances. We hope that the ideas and takeaways we've shared can be helpful to you as you navigate the challenges of scaling your teams.
So thank you for your time. As we mentioned, this is just where we are so far, and there's more still to be tried and learned. If you want to talk more about the web community at Twitter, we'd love to continue the discussion where else on Twitter. So look us up and say hi, and enjoy the rest of the conference.